Good afternoon. Thanks for coming out this afternoon for this edition of Talks At. Today's speaker is David Burkus. His latest book, Under New Management, which many of you have, but Steve doesn't, reveals the counterintuitive leadership practices that enhance engagement and drive performance. He's also the author of Myths of Creativity, the truth about how innovative companies and people generate great ideas. I'm personally hoping we have some time to talk about that today. He's a contributor to the Harvard Business Review and Forbes. He's also been featured in Fast Company, the Financial Times, Bloomberg, Business Week, and CBS This Morning. He's been a featured and keynote speaker at many Fortune 500 companies, including this one, as well as Microsoft and Stryker. He's also been, he's a TEDx speaker. I've watched some of his video on the YouTube and TED channel. He's also been at South by Southwest, and he's also done speaking with the at the U.S. Naval Academy and the Naval Postgraduate School. He's an associate professor at Oral Roberts University, where he teaches and lives with his wife and their two boys. So please join me in welcoming David to speak to you today. Thanks very much.
No, you're never supposed to say I'm excited to be here as a speaker. This is one of coaching rule number 2. Right after they tell you not to don't actually picture them in their underwear. They tell you don't say you're excited to be here because what's the alternative? You're really mad and ticked off to be here, which is not true. I'm legitimately excited to be here, mostly because one thing that I guess I normally leave off my bio, but for here is particularly relevant, is that I grew up in Groton, Massachusetts, and I haven't been back in Boston in 5 years. And so it's really exciting to me to actually finally be back here. So thank you for having me, just because you got me back to my hometown, which is great. I have a thesis. And I saw a couple of people flipping through copies of the book, and you probably don't know it yet, because for some reason, unlike a good researcher, I put it at the end. Mainly, I was writing the entire book, and I was having these conversations with a variety of different corporate and entrepreneurial leaders. And one person during one of the conversations said something that I thought was brilliant, and so I decided I should put it in the book, and I made the mistake of putting it at the end. And I'd say it was a mistake because it's really sort of the guiding thesis for the entire book, and it's this. Great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. And I realize how dangerous it is to say that at a place like this, right? But what I mean is that innovations to the factory being a metaphor for all of our workplaces, precede innovations to the products, right? The innovations that we make to how we work and where we work precede our ability to innovate in any other situation. And this has been true for hundreds of years. This was true when a young junior consultant first approached Bethlehem Steel and said, I can turn around your problem. Now, you've probably never heard of Bethlehem Steel, that's okay, but their impact resonated for hundreds of years. See, this young junior consultant wanted to help Bethlehem Steel compete with bigger captains of industry like Carnegie Steel and a variety of different places. And so he came with what would later be his world-renowned stopwatch. And he began to study the production process at Bethlehem Steel. And he began to find the optimal way to design that production process. And then he started training the labor force on how to conform to that one best way. And he revolutionized the entire history of manufacturing. He made it possible in the early 1900s for a variety of different industrial growth. Some of you are nodding your heads because you figured out who it is. But if you haven't yet, I'll give you a famous quote that sort of embodies what he believed about the role of management and labor. And it was this: the duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing this cooperation rests with management alone. He was big on the idea that you had management and you had labor, and it was best to keep the two separate because labor was too dumb to know how to do something the right way. So it was management's job to teach them how to do it, labor's job to just do it, right? This man was Frederick Winslow Taylor. How many of you remember Frederick Winslow Taylor? So I teach undergraduate management classes, and so we have to spend the first 2 weeks talking about the amazing contribution of Frederick Taylor and also why he was totally wrong. Right? Frederick Taylor was definitely right for his era. He knew that you had to reinvent the factory in order to have all of the innovations we needed to grow. That was very true, and his impact resonated for a really long time. Taylor would write a book called The Principles of Scientific Management that is still in print. It's been over 100 years. Principles of Scientific Management would travel the globe. It would be translated in a variety of languages. Actually, Taylor's grandson remarked one time that he went to Japan to visit executives, and they bowed very deeply to him just because he was the grandson of Frederick Taylor. Taylor's devotees would start a magazine about scientific management that would morph and change, and you know it now as Bloomberg Businessweek. It got its start as a fanzine for Frederick Taylor. He also joined the faculty at Tuck, Dartmouth Business School, one of the first business schools in the country. And he revolutionized Bethlehem Steel in a variety of different industries. We got where we are right now because of what Frederick Taylor did in the physical factories. But where we are right now is not a physical factory. It doesn't look like it. I have not been to many actual manufacturing plants with food this good, right? So it is not a physical factory. We've moved from a physical factory to an idea factory. The products usually aren't made by brute force, right? The unit of energy or where it lies is not the bicep anymore, it's the brain, right? We designed it in our heads. We've moved from a physical factory to an idea factory. But we drug Frederick Taylor with us from the factory to the office. And a lot of the ideas inside of management theorists are based in Frederick Taylor's theories. He's the foundation for almost all management thinking. And while we point to things, Peter Drucker was the first to do it, we point to things that signal the shift from industrial work to the knowledge economy. We don't necessarily point to the things that we should probably have not taken with us. And so today I want to talk briefly about a lot of those different things. I've surveyed the Googlers that I know about what would be controversial but not too controversial. Because a lot of these ideas, I find that every innovative company I've spoke at is either doing some of them or deliberately not doing others. And so we'll have that conversation, which I think will be a lot of fun. But I want to start with one that's probably not one of the things you think about, even though it's so vital to our work every day. And when you do think about it, you may not have very positive thoughts. I want to talk about email. And I realize I'm speaking to the group that power like half the world's email. And so I don't want to tell you you're wrong, but I do want to join with you in saying, how many of you actually hate your email inbox? And the Gmail inbox is one of the better ones, right? For dealing with the problem of email, right? Everybody's making note on who raised their hand, by the way. It's kind of funny. Everybody's looking around, who hates email? Email is an amazing tool. It's an amazing invention. And like most amazing inventions, we're using it for stuff it was never designed to do, right? How many of you use it as a to-do list? How many of you ever said the phrase, if it's not in my inbox, it won't get done, right? This was not what it's originally intended for. And we have this idea, right, that, actually, here's another one. This is probably, I'm guilty of doing this, and I wrote this chapter. How many of you have ever cleared out, gotten to inbox 0 and thought, wow, I had a really productive day today? And then you're driving home or you're taking the T home and you're like, oh, actually, I didn't do anything today except respond to email, right? So we have this theory that it equals productivity, but it's an inverted U. And a lot of places are finding that it is that exact inverted U, that productivity can go up through the communication and collaboration that it allows for, but it can also go dramatically down. And one company in particular that fascinated me was a French company called Atos, a technology company that basically said our productivity is not happening the way we want it to. And so, led by their CEO, they moved to become a zero email company, zero internal email. They created a variety of different products and tools in order to use communication tools. It's actually kind of weird that I'm sitting here talking about this, because when people ask me what my favorite tool to replace email is, I tell them Google Wave. I loved it. Can I just say that? I loved it. Apparently other people didn't, but I thought it was brilliant, right? So maybe this is where we start bringing that back, right? With this idea that let's replace. Anyway, so they moved to become a zero email company. They custom designed a tool for them, but a lot of other companies are finding the same thing, and they're using old school tools like the phone, or like getting up out of their desk and walking over and having a conversation. It's fascinating. But the idea that all of these share is that email has a variety of different costs and benefits, and the costs are beginning to not outweigh the benefits. So Atos moved to become a zero email company. They're still moving to become a zero email company. They're not quite there yet, but they have found that as email is going down, a variety of positives are happening. Their operating margin has increased, their earnings per share have increased, their administrative costs have decreased, because again, there's just less email to have to sort through. It's been a really good thing for them, and they become advocates for this sort of zero email lifestyle. But honestly, how many of you are sitting here and thinking, okay, there's no way I can do without my email inbox, right? I like it, I use it as my to-do list, etc. You have to see what I just saw. I saw a bunch of people looking down and then holding their hand up, like, I'm embarrassed to say. I'm with you too. I can't find a way to do without it, but there are ways that we can put buffers on it, right? There are other policies besides zero email. We have limited email, which is saying that we only email at certain times. So there's like a dedicated time for the email blitz, and then you focus in on doing the deep work. And then there's work hours email. One of my favorite corporate examples is a company that literally shuts the server off at 6 p.m. So if you want to take your laptop home with you, if you're that person that everybody knows who you are because you like to email at 11:30 at night, if you're that person, that's totally cool. We just won't get your emails until 8 a.m. the next morning when the server comes back on. Right? What all of these have in common is two things. The idea of allowing people to design their workday in a way that works for them. Right? Email is an amazing tool because it's cheap and it's asynchronous. It's cheap to send, and we send a lot of it. And it's asynchronous, so we can send it whenever we want. But what we don't think about is the fact that that means people receive it whenever we want to send it. Which means that it's great that you can take it and you can use it to design your perfect workday, but your perfect workday butts up against other people's ability to design their perfect workday. And we've never had this conversation. And you may begin to become a champion for zero or limited hours of work. That's honestly not the point. The point is we've never had a conversation about what is the right communication tool for our project, what is the right communication tool for our team, and then what are our own individual limits. Right? I've talked with a lot of different people, mostly subordinates who report to a manager who likes to email at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. And even though they know they don't have to, there's always that subtle pressure that you have to respond quickly. And we've never had that open and frank conversation, right? So whether it's zero email, whether it's outlawing email entirely, or whether it's actually having a conversation with your team of, hey, what is the best way to communicate and collaborate? Which tool do we want to use? We can see a lot of positive effects just from taking a deep look at how we collaborate, how we communicate. I want to move into one of my favorites. This comes from HLC Technologies, based out of India, but it's this idea of putting customers second. Now, I know that the Boston location has a variety of the sales team, a variety of different Googlers, right? And this idea in sales that the customer is always right. How many of you ever said that? How many of you ever been the customer and invoked that? That's when you hear it. Do you ever notice you always hear it then? Customer's always right when you're the customer, right? And of course, you pull that line and somebody wants to say in their head, like, but you're totally wrong in this instance, but I have to pretend that you're right, right? So what is this idea of putting customers second? It's essentially this idea that in order to move customer loyalty, you have to look at what creates it. It's not a goal, it's an effect, and we have to look at what the cause is. Customer loyalty is created inside of a value zone. And to explain how a value zone works, let's dive deep on the org chart. And this isn't all that deep. It's actually only a few boxes and lines. But already you can visualize what your own reporting relationships have ever looked like, right? What happens in almost every company that has ever been started has a founder or founders. And as the organization scales, generally those founders move up through the ranks, right? So naturally, as you're teaching other people how to do what you used to do and you now outsource to another person, either inside the company or outside of it, right? You want to keep that person informed and accountable, right? So most org charts work that way. Information flows down, accountability flows up. The front line is accountable to the management structures, et cetera. And at HLC Technologies, Vinette Nair, the CEO, basically said, where is the value being created? Because most of the times in customer loyalty and in customer satisfaction, the value is not being created at the place that we're holding people accountable to. So he created what he sort of termed the value zone. And the value zone was that place where people interact with the customer. If you're in a role that interacts with the customer, or you have an activity that interacts with the customer, you are in the value zone. You're the one creating the value, right? And so we have to think about this information and accountability thing as it pertains to the value zone, because most of the time, people in the value zone have a divided loyalty. The customer is always right, but I have to get my boss whatever she needs. And that creates a divided loyalty that can cause tension, right? And in some fields, I mean, we've even seen it. I will not ask you to raise your hand on this one because you may not want to, but we've even seen situations where in order to please a customer, the person who used to be serving that customer is thrown under the bus so the management can come in and solve the problem. Now, what does that do future for wanting to continue to create value, wanting to continue to serve customers? It doesn't really help all that much. And so what HLC did was essentially turn their entire org chart upside down. They reversed that accountability and they built in extra transparency. What reversed accountability means is they turned the org chart upside down and they said, we in the management and in the support functions are accountable to the value zone. Wherever the value zone is, and as we change our business model, wherever it goes, we need to be accountable to it, even to the point of creating a customer service ticket system for people in the value zone. So you're serving a customer, right? There is the normal sort of customer complaint, customer satisfaction ticket system. They use a similar one for, I'm in the value zone and I need something and I've got to figure out where it comes from. We create a customer support ticket, and only the person in the value zone who created that ticket can close it. And managers are actually rated and bonused on how well are you serving these, how well are you closing out these tickets, how well are you getting these people they need. So it's this idea, again, that accountability rests in the value zone. Transparency took a really interesting form, and in the HR world, we love to talk about 360 feedback, right? But what we usually mean by that is manager, peers, and a couple of hand-picked subordinates. They went a step further, and they said that every single person that interacts with you has a right to give you feedback and has a right to see the feedback you're getting from other places. Extending out this idea of transparency of feedback, extending out this idea of accountability to that value zone. And the results were pretty incredible. I don't think you have to dive too deep into it, but I want to explain why they were so incredible. See, we have, again, this idea that customer loyalty is what we're striving for. Customer loyalty predicts profitability, and that's true. Increased market share, increased profits are generally tied into customer loyalty, but customer loyalty is an effect. It's not a cause. It comes after certain other conditions are met. Mainly, we have what we call the service profit chain, that customer loyalty drives profits. We know this. Profits come from customer loyalty. Customer loyalty is most strongly predicted by employee satisfaction. That's why the food is so good. It's most strongly predicted by employee satisfaction, and that's most strongly predicted by designing your org chart in a way to figure out what that value zone is and put those people first. And by the way, you may not be able to do this with an entire organization, but you can still do it in whatever function you serve. Who is our customer for our team? Who is our customer for our broader department? How do we best serve them, and how do we make ourselves accountable to the people that service that customer? And this, what I think is most interesting about this is not an idea that's all that new. The service profit chain has been around for a really long time, developed by professors who basically study on this side of the river and on the other side of the river. And we've been advocating this for a long time. But often people aren't willing to take that flip the org chart mentality, that value zone mentality. And what I think HLC provides us is an opportunity to look at exactly what happens when we put that value zone first. And we say that, you know what, the customer may always be right, but in order to make the customer right, we have to put our own people first. And we see this in a couple different companies throughout, but there's sort of these bright stars of employees first. One of my favorite ones is Danny Meyer, founder of, how many of you like Shake Shack? Yes, 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 awesome. I was in New York earlier this week and was like making a point to go to every Union Square restaurant that I could go to because the service is amazing, and I wanted to see it for myself. Danny Meyer, the founder of Union Square, basically says this about the service. He sums up the service profit chain in a restaurant-oriented quote: "The interest of our own employees must be placed directly ahead of those of our guests, because the only way we can consistently earn raves, win repeat business, develop bonds of loyalty with our guests, is to first ensure that our own team members feel jazzed about coming to work." One of my other favorite ones is from Howard Schultz of Starbucks. Howard Schultz, if you're unfamiliar with the Starbucks story, you know that Howard Schultz grew it to its notoriety and then stepped back from the CEO role just into a chairman role, and a lot of things changed. The changes were subtle at first, but you could eventually taste them. And so Schultz decided to come back, needed to turn the stock price around, and so one of the biggest things that a lot of the investors were arguing for was, you know, Howard, you can cut the health insurance plan. You're trying to turn the stock price around. Nobody will blame you for that. They'll understand that you need to do it. He said, you know what? You should probably sell your stock because we're not going to do that. Why? Because I do not believe that shareholder value is sustainable if you're not creating value for the people who are doing the work. Again, we see business leaders summarizing in their own ways and in their own stories a service profit chain idea that's been around for a really long time. Made me most excited to see. This is one of those ideas in the book, again, that's not new, but is an example of what it means to upend business as usual. Okay, I asked a bunch of different people which chapter in the book I should talk about, and they all said this one. And I was not planning on talking about it, but I do think that most people want to hear either why their office is amazing or why it's not. So shall we dive into it? So, does anybody know by curiosity where the trend towards open offices started? No, you know why, right? I'll give you where it started, but we like to conveniently forget that it started here. It actually started with Jay Chiat and Chiat Day Advertising. If you've ever seen the famous 1984 commercial, Throwing the Hammer Through the Big Brother Screen, that was developed by them. And they had this revolutionary idea of creating the first open office, totally nomadic office. You got a locker and a laptop, and you got to find your own place, right? And it was a brilliant idea in theory. And they spent millions of dollars transforming their office space, and it became a disaster. My favorite stories out of it is you had people who would arrive at work at 4 a.m. and put their laptop down to claim a desk, and then go back to their car and sleep for a few hours so they could come back and get their favorite place, right? You had people cramming stuff into lockers because you could have no like tchotchkes whatsoever, no personal flair, no symbols of what you were about in that space. You had to have them in your locker. One woman couldn't actually fit everything she needed to do her job in the locker, so she became known as the Red Wagon Lady because she would pull around a little red wagon with all of her stuff. This was before we started doing those crates and the bags with wheels and whatever, right? Which, speaking of innovative products, I still don't know why it took so long to figure out wheels on bags. But this happened before we figured that out. And so she became the little red wagon lady, right? What happens and essentially with the open offices is this. First of all, there's this whole conversation about whether or not people are introverts and extroverts and what they actually want. And let me kill this for you right now. Introversion and extroversion is a sliding scale. And every single person is different on it. Right? If you take a Big 5 test, you're all going to get different numbers. You're very rarely placed into that box. And so the idea that we can find one perfect place for you is foolish because what you need varies by the type of work you do and how you would score on that, right? But even looking company-wide, there's a balance, there's a trade-off, right? The research, right, in favor of open offices will say things like, oh, it increases collaboration, it increases creativity, there's these serendipitous experiences, right? And so it's for those benefits. It helps that it's a lot cheaper. Let's just say. But then on the other side, we never really talk about these studies. The studies show that people are more likely to experience stress, especially where you sit in the open office. Have you ever noticed if you've got kind of open seating, people gravitate towards being able to put their back towards the wall? That's pretty ancient in human psychology and human development, right? This idea that we need to be able to see the whole room, and we do it. And if you're one of the people who doesn't get that, you're actually experiencing more stress, right? In addition, there are increases in distraction, right? Some places have tried to mitigate this by having this sort of earbud code, right? 2 earbuds in means don't talk to me, 1 means ask, 2 means you can come up to me. If some of you are looking at me like you've never heard that before. All right, cool, that might be your only takeaway from today. That's awesome. And that might have just super helped, right? But we've come up with that as a response to having to sort of cope with the distraction factor that happens in these offices. And then my favorite study shows that people in an open office floor plan are more likely to call in sick to work more often, which means they're either legitimately sick more or they're sick of their open office. In either case, again, it comes down to having a broader conversation about individual differences. And here's the challenge and here's the truth, right? The number one factor that affects office environment. It's not cool offices, it's not free food, it's not funky design, although I absolutely love the tea thing going on in the elevators. That's awesome. But the number one factor that affects employees, how environment affects employees' performance is perceived control. How much control you have to move around, to change your office as you work there, right? And to adjust it to the needs of when you're working with individuals, teams, when you're doing deep work, or when you need that serendipity, perceived control. And so it's really not a question of closing open offices, opening up closed offices, et cetera, but it's that idea that we should start from the assumption of what do I need to do to give my team perceived control. I've been in a lot of really beautiful offices where people aren't even allowed to change the number of picture frames on their desk. What do you think that does to perceived control, right? And this, by the way, this ties in with a huge stream of research around the importance of autonomy. If we're saying we want to give people autonomy, we want to give people free time, we want to give people the ability to control how they do their work, but we don't let them control where they do their work, then we're giving them false promises about autonomy. Right? One of my favorite offices that designs this, or the office design, a lot of people have a lot of different terms for it. My favorite term for it is creating a palette of places. Creating a palette of places where people can exert their perceived control. So a palette of places looks like this. You can go to your little cafe in the front floor. You can go to the long tables where everybody is. You can go to your private corral. You can book a meeting room. Most of the time in the service of perceived control, there are more seats than people, right? Why? Because again, we want to send the message of perceived control that you are free to roam. How many of you feel like you know where you need to be when you're doing certain types of work, right? But to restrict you to just one place limits your ability to sort of exert that perceived control, right? Some of the best offices also organize around what we call neighborhoods, right? So there are certain departmental neighborhoods, and you know you're most likely to find the colleagues you need to find there, but you also know that if they're not there, presence and performance aren't correlated, right? It doesn't mean they're not working, it just means they're working sort of somewhere else. We're putting it back in the service of perceived control. One of my favorites is the perf, right? It's perf season, isn't it? Yeah, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about the perf. I'll give you a very, very brief story of a hugely innovative company that sort of ditched the perf altogether, that basically threw it in the trash can, and that's Adobe. Adobe, as you know, has moved from that sort of products, boxes on the shelf, the way you used to have to get Photoshop, to now Adobe Creative Cloud and this idea of paying a subscription. And it triggered a conversation about what are the other things we're doing legacy on a yearly cycle or a 6-month cycle, et cetera. And they ended up taking a deep look at their performance evaluations and deciding to throw it in the trash. Some of you may be wanting to throw your perf in the trash right now. Others of you might like it, and that's cool. And I can tell you why both of you feel the exact same way, right? Why? In order to tell you why, let me first tell you what Adobe did. They moved from the performance appraisal system to a system of expectations, feedback, and growth and development that they called check-ins. A check-in is any conversation, can happen very frequently, can happen every few months, mostly happens sort of on a monthly or every 6 weeks basis. It could take as little as 10 minutes, can take as long as you want. And it's centered around expectations, feedback, and growth and development. Expectations, setting, tracking, reviewing what the objectives are. Not only what your objectives are for performance, but what your expectations for me are if I'm the manager, right? Feedback is the same way, giving and receiving ongoing feedback and coaching. And then growth and development. Where do you want to go? Talking about opportunities. How does your role fit into the broader spectrum, and where do you want to go? What I think is great about the check-in process is twofold, right? And why it works is twofold. First, we have perspective, right? We have this idea that giving performance appraisals is vital, giving feedback is vital to increasing performance. And that's true, but most places do it on an annual basis or a 6-month basis, right? And so most places give that feedback. But imagine for a minute, like the hypothetical example I use is imagine you're a football team, and you play every Sunday, and you're gonna play this Sunday, but we're not gonna tell you the score for 6 months when we do your next perf. How likely is it you can make course corrections easily? Not that likely. Feedback in the office works the exact same way. The more frequently you can give that perspective of feedback, the more frequently you can iterate towards better performance, right? So we might normally do an annual review. Some places go to 6 months, right? But these one-on-one informal discussions staged throughout are hugely vital. Now here's why I think this is so important, even though I know it's perf season, right? Is that I normally only get to have the ear of people in HR when I make my case for ditching performance appraisals, but every single person can learn from check-ins and one-on-one informal discussions. Right? If you remember nothing else other than the earbud thing, maybe we can also add on, because by the way, rule 3 of speaking is you're not supposed to say if you remember anything else, so I'm gonna leave you with like 4. So if you remember this too, right? Expectations, feedback, growth and development. Even if you have to do perf every 6 months, if you can every week, every 2 weeks, every month, have a conversation that centers around those things, that is frank and honest, then when we arrive at the next formal appraisal cycle, we arrive at a conversation that doesn't surprise anyone, that doesn't create negotiations over what your rank is and what your label is or any of that. We just arrive at one more conversation in an ever continuous improvement cycle of feedback, expectations, and growth and development. So that's performance appraisals. Overall, because I want to get to some time to questions, I knew lots of people begged me for the open office question, the perf question, because that's where we are. At least among the ones I surveyed, who you're not allowed to know who they are, might affect them. But every time that I talk about these ideas, and every time that I talk about that shift from industrial work to knowledge work, and every time I tell an HR VP that you should ditch performance appraisals, I get a very similar response. I either get love it or loathe it. Right? Love it or loathe it. And the loathe it's always say, we have no reason to change. What we're doing here is working. What we're doing here is working. Why change, right? And every time I hear that, I think about the same thing. I think about the internal combustion engine. Why? Because I'm a nerd, but also because, actually, this is one of the rare times I can ask this in the history of speaking. How many of you have studied physics as an undergrad? Yes. And what do you know about the internal combustion engine and its ability to take gasoline and transform it into forward motion? It's thermodynamics. It's very inefficient. It is 30% efficient, right? 30% of the energy in gasoline and that fuel gets actually transferred into forward motion. The rest is lost to heat and friction and the rules of thermodynamics. 30% efficient, right? And yet we experiment with a lot of ways to make that more efficient, right? Whether that's putting a new engine in the car or making the car self-driving, we continue to experiment, right? The human engine is no different. The organization is no different, right? For most of us, the fuel running most organizations isn't brute labor and it's not gasoline, right? It might be Red Bull, but it's not gasoline. It's mental energy. And when we talk about mental energy, one of our best metrics for measuring efficiency is the employee engagement metrics, first made famous by Gallup, but a variety of different researchers use a variety of different metrics, all to try and say how much of our whole selves are we bringing to work, how much of our mental energy are we bringing to work, how many people inside our organization are bringing their whole selves to work. And what we find is, worldwide, the number is about 18%. It's worse than the internal combustion engine. In the US, it's about 30%. And I suspect here it's higher, but I've never met an organization that even takes it to 50%, right? Meaning that 50% of the time or 50% of the people feel like they bring their whole mental energy to work, right? So why is it okay to continue to experiment with an engine, but it's not okay to continue to experiment with an organization? And that's my central idea around this thesis. What Frederick Taylor did was he figured out how to optimize for brute force and how to make it more efficient. And we drug a lot of those principles with us from the factory to the office. And suddenly now what we're doing is working, so it's not okay to continue to question it. The leaders, the entrepreneurs, the corporate leaders, the researchers that I profile in Under New Management are all not satisfied with the engine as usual. And honestly, not every one of these ideas works for every single organization, but every single one of them is an experiment. It's a moonshot. It's an attempt to raise this number. And I'm not an optimist. Right? I don't believe that we can get to 100%. I'm a whatever is slightly less depressed than an optimist. I'm not a pessimist, but whatever is slightly less depressed than an optimist. Right? I don't believe that we can get that number up to 100%, but God, if we could get it to 50, if most Americans had a coin flip chance of finding a job that engaged them, that'd be amazing, right? I have two sons. They're 4 and they're 2, right? And this is honestly what drives me around this, is that I'm thinking about 15, 20 years from now where they go to work. Can we change the engine and get it to the point where they have a coin flip chance of being engaged, right? Even in an organization that lots of people like to write about, like Google, that you know people who are not bringing their whole selves to work. Can we experiment? Can we change these ideas? Can we play around with new modes and methods to raise this number up, right? Great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. So let's turn our conversation to how we can innovate the factory and let that be the huge surge that precedes a wave of product innovation. We can get there. We can. It just takes continued experimentation. Great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. With that said, what questions do you have about how we innovate a factory?
So on the open floor plan issue.
Yeah.
The book Making Software cites some sociology studies that were put together on open offices versus closed offices. Mm-hmm. And it basically came down to, if the task was an individual sort of task, closed doors help. If it's a collaborative task, then having open space helps. Why do you cite it as just individual preference?
So I think it's a combination of things, right? Most people, I definitely think it's the type of work. And most people, I don't think you can say do one type of work one way. So I think there's a human psychology piece, which is individual differences, and then I think there's the type of work that people do. But then even if you combine those, like you times those two by each other and you have a factor of a variety of different things. Like I tend to, because my training's in organizational psychology, tend to lean towards that side. But it does, the type of work being done also influences it, but there's a confounding factor of how an individual likes to do that type of work. Right? So I'm a writer, and I know people that love to write in solace, and I know people that will deliberately go to a cafe in order to write with all sorts of noise around them. Same type of work, but the individual difference is sort of also a confounding factor in it.
Should we focus more on what environment fails less for the opposite task when it comes up, and not, the obvious fact that open offices are better for collaboration and closed offices are better for independent work?
I think it comes, I side on the side of perceived control. Like, I think when we need to think about how we design a whole place, we need to know that there's a ton of different types of work and a ton of different ways that people like to do that type of work. And so that palette of places approach gives perceived control over to the person and gives them the individual idea. That does mean we have to have a conversation about how you can know whether or not you're being productive, right? Because sometimes we might feel like we're being productive, but we're actually being distracted often. See email, as an example. But I think, again, it comes down to that idea of designing a place that works for a variety of different means and then just setting people free to kind of figure it out.
So, performance.
Yeah.
We all hate it. And one of the reasons...
Performance appraisals.
Performance appraisals, right.
Sorry.
Not high performance.
Right. I was going to say, I think I'm in the wrong room if that's the case.
Perf.
Right.
We all hate it, right? And one of the reasons I hate it is...
He's saying this on camera, by the way. I was deliberately not asking questions about this one.
That's fine.
No, go for it.
There's a tension between being honest and playing the game.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm talking to my boss, I really don't want to tell him, you know what? Monday and Tuesday this week, I got nothing done, and I'm in a bad mood, and I hate my coworker. And by the way, you made a stupid mistake yesterday at the meeting, which completely derailed blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Do I really want to say things like that? And how is continuous, your continuous process any better? My boss is not my therapist.
Right.
And can influence my career, right?
Right.
So how do you deal with this tension between honesty and productive feedback?
So the first challenge is, other than, actually your comment reminded me of that scene in Office Space where he describes what he does, and he's like, I get to work and I just kind of stare at the wall for like 15 minutes. So you don't want to admit that, right? Although he admits it and he gets promoted. It starts from the things that you said my boss doesn't kind of want to hear. Part of him doesn't want to hear it. Part of him needs to hear it, right? Or part of her needs to hear it, right? And so it begins from that place of understanding that these sessions aren't necessarily to be used to label. They're to be used to have that conversation, and it takes an openness at that level to actually hear that feedback. Now, for some people, it takes a lot of training to get them to that point where they're sort of open to hearing that feedback. Teaching people how to, one of my writer friends said, teaching people how to hug their haters so they can actually learn and grow from it. The biggest thing is the lack of formality of the event. I think what causes a lot of the stress and the playing the game that you said is that it eventually gets documented, goes in a file, and so it's very careful about what goes in the file, what doesn't go in the file. And when you can, and it's a lot of times it'll take some time to ramp up to it, but when you can sort of actually get people to believe that, no, we're having an open, honest conversation, none of it's getting written down, none of it's going in a file, let's just talk. Gradually, people start to lower their guard. It will not happen the first time. Like I said, I'm one step below optimism. Whatever is one step less pessimistic than an optimist, I'm that. So it won't happen right away. But the hope is that if we shift to that and we really get people to believe that these are informal conversations, they're not going in the file, they're just about how do we get you what you need, then we can actually move towards it.
Okay, as a fairly quick follow-up.
Yeah.
And we do have procedures here where you can ask for advice from someone outside your management chain.
Right.
Right. Which I haven't taken advantage of enough, I'm sure. Does it make sense for the same person to be managing you day to day and evaluating you and getting honest feedback? Are those all the same role?
It varies a lot, right? So one of the chapters which is, I didn't go into it today, but one of the chapters we have in Under New Management is about the companies that really do fire the manager, right? And then there are other companies that try and do it and find that they need a management structure. And it comes down to there are certain roles in management, and every organization, based on the type of work and the culture, can decide who best does those roles. And sometimes they decide the team works it better, that peers do it better. Sometimes they decide that management does it better. But you're absolutely right. One of the things I love about in the accountability piece around doing 360 for management was that it was that idea that everybody who's interacted you throughout the year has that ability to leave you feedback, right? Which I think it's hard to, again, do that in an informal conversation. That said, the hope and the assumption is that your manager and the people on your team, the people who work closest with you, are the most invested in your long-term success, your long-term performance. And so because of that emotional investment, they're probably the best one to have the informal conversation with. But you're absolutely right. Most of us work with people who are not technically on our team, and we still collaborate with them at times. And that data isn't really getting captured in a very good system. Some of that's the nature of the beast, and some of it is we shouldn't allow it to happen. We should spread it out.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you for the talk. So staying on this topic, so getting rid of performance evaluations, I want to look under the cover of that a little bit.
Everybody wants to, it's the right season.
It reminds me of politicians who say that we should get rid of the Internal Revenue Service. That sounds superficially
Right.
appealing, but at the end of the day, those things still need to get done.
Right.
And so in my past many years of being a manager, I've come to realize that a lot of this process is not about torturing the individual employees. It's really about forcing managers to do the right things.
Right. Okay.
So without things like curves, for example, you'll have lazy managers who, give everyone the same score. They're conflict averse, or they'll, just give the bennies to their friends or whatever, right? And so we need sort of the managers, kind of have a structure to make sure the right things happen. And that has to happen anyway, I think. So to me, it feels like a false dichotomy. It's not really get rid of the performance evaluation. It's really you need both, right?
Right.
A good manager should be doing those other things all the time anyway.
Yeah.
But you still need a formal process. You still need a process to compare people in an objective way. You still need to decide about promotions and raises and who's not performing and so on and so forth. So
no, so in general I agree, right? So there's a teeny bit of hyperbole to get rid of the IRS, right? Because it's always, if you deep down, we're going to replace it with something, or it's not, and hopefully that person doesn't get a plurality of the vote. But so it's always a situation where you're replacing it with something. In this case, I love the Adobe example because what they replaced it with was, okay, we're going to get rid of this formal system, but we're going to, and one of the things I sort of didn't roll out is we're going to replace it with coaching managers on how to have these conversations, when to have these conversations, a lot of different training on it. And that can only really happen in a culture, too, that reinforces those ideas, that feedback, that evaluation, that keeping track of who needs what in order to be ready for promotions, et cetera, is hugely important. So you can't just sort of strip it. You're absolutely right. What you can do is train that informal system. But it does take, and honestly, it takes a lot more work than just saying, well, we do perf every 6 months, we do an annual review, whatever. That's the way to accomplish the objective with less energy than does this. But the ROI on this is significantly better, I believe, right? Because you're training people on how to do it and you're giving it more frequently.
you can certainly imagine, throwing the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, where you go too far basically and have to
Absolutely,
bring
right?
back.
No, I think, and in general, I think that's what the conversation I see in management that hasn't happened that should is that we, as I said before, we drug a lot of Taylorism with us from the factory to the office, and we never really had a conversation about what parts of it we should use and what parts we shouldn't, and as the nature of work evolves, a lot of it's going to fall by the wayside, but that doesn't mean we have to stop doing it. It means we have to say, what does management look like, right? How do we innovate the factory? We can't just let it be free range, but how do we innovate? What do we replace it with? Yeah, absolutely. Hi.
Hi. So to expand upon that, in addition to what does management look like, I think you said every time you present it to HR, the response is so.
Well, love it or loathe it, but yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
what would your vision be for a sort of future HR? Because I feel like we've had lots of innovation in lots of different industries, but HR is pretty consistent. And at Google, it's a little bit different, but very few HR have come from actually doing the work in the individual roles, and yet they're part of evaluating. So how does that need to evolve to support, and what does that look like at Adobe?
So,
you can share?
So you actually pointed to my favorite thing that has to change right off the bat, which is the idea that twofold, the idea that you can be in HR or people operations without having been anywhere else, but also that you can get very high in the organization in most companies all the way up to the senior levels without ever having done a stint in HR, right? And I think we need to see that as one other path that is, or one other stop in a path that is vital, not just for people to start somewhere else and migrate to HR, but also if they're wanting to migrate up through the organization to do it through HR. For that reason, I think there needs to be a broader conversation about the type of work, what that requires. And my hope is that that would change the culture for most organizations. And true or not true to that value zone concept, for most organizations, HR, people operations, is an overhead. It doesn't really create that value. Yet at the same time, if our people create all of our value, then the conversations about what are the developmental needs of our people, who are the ones that are performing stronger than others, those things are vital to continuing to create value. So my hope is, HR will use the term, we hope we have a seat at the table, but I also hope they get up from their table and go and sit down at other departmental tables too. I think we start there, if we can. Thank you.
Hi, different subject. I'm interested very much in your thoughts on managed by Q. I don't know whether you'd be willing to say too much about a particular company, but in their case, it seems quite unique. And also, I think it's probably the most radical attempt out there to innovate the factory that's going on. And I'm wondering if you think they can possibly succeed, and whether they can possibly have an impact on the whole outsourced service industry that we have. I assume you know what I'm talking about?
So managed by Q, as in like QUE?
No, Q as
Like in the letter?
Q, the James Bond guy who did all that stuff. Managed by Q, it's sorry to have to explain this. I thought you, of all people, would be totally up on this, but Managed by Q is a company that is in the service industry, and they, instead of having the model of having the absolute lowest wages, benefits, whatever out there, they're competing with cleaning companies, companies that go into offices in cities and do cleaning, and that have the absolute lowest wages, benefits, hire the most immigrants, the whole thing. These guys have a totally different model. They pay their employees well. They have health insurance. More importantly, they have more management type responsibilities, and they're encouraged to interact directly with their clients in the building. It's a totally different model of how a company can do a service industry.
Right.
If they succeed, which is really the big question, that model threatens to completely revolutionize the whole model of how service industries in general have developed in this country. This is a massively important thing that's going on.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
No worries. So admittedly, this is me being the org psychologist that always loves to see a lot of data. Admittedly, my jury's still out on that. There are things to what you just described that I really like, especially the idea of the interaction with client piece, and the idea, again, of taking care of people who are in that value zone and knowing that that's where value is created. I tend to reserve judgment, passing judgment on things like that, because I'm not good at forecasting, right? I'm trained as a psychologist, so I'm only good at looking back and going, this seems to predict this. So the same thing, I get a similar question often around like holacracy and those sort of things, and I just think like, let's ride this one out. I can see arguments for it, arguments against it, and as it scales, I think we'll have a better idea of where we can go in forming an opinion on it. I know that's sort of a non-answer, and I know it's political season, so we're all attuned to non-answers, but I'd honestly prefer to keep my jury still deliberating on that one.
Yeah, it's okay. It's definitely an experiment.
Yeah.
The guy behind it is totally serious. He has a profit model that he'll explain to you and the whole thing. Whether it will succeed, I don't really know, but it's gotten a lot of press recently. It's something you should definitely look into.
No, I mean, and I'll say one other thing towards that, which is that there's a tendency among a lot of different people to say this is the way to do it. This is we're going to write the operating system for management, et cetera. And the challenge is that in general, as the nature of work changes, every organization needs something slightly different from the management. And then as the people who come into the organization change, we have that, again, that individual differences versus the type of work thing. The needs of every individual management change. I know a lot of different people who have promoted their model of this is how we should do it. I don't have a 4-box model and that type of thing. I just have here are the ideas and the experiments, but every company has to wrestle with how we apply those. I think maybe we have time for about one more. I'm getting the time of day notification. So.
Great, thanks. So
and we can
Bruce
chat afterwards. I definitely want to chat.
It's Bruce Hecht, and I work in design, and I have a it's a 2-question, so you could pick up either one, or depending on the time, but there's a conventional systems question of how the pieces fit together, and then maybe an unconventional question. The conventional part is, I was curious, have you thought about the way different kinds of managements intersect? So there's the people management, that you're describing, but it
Project
intersects
management,
with
operations
project,
management.
product, operations.
Yeah.
And then the second part of the question is, what about if there's AI? So if you submit jobs out to Mechanical Turk, it could be a person, it could be a computer.
Right.
Does this mean we should be finding ways to use the techniques that would work also for computers? Or does it mean that we should find ways to take what we've learned and apply it to people? Or any thoughts?
Wow. I knew I'd get awesome questions. Okay, so admittedly, the second one, I'm probably going to be thinking about the entire plane ride home.
Nice.
So then maybe, I can't say I'll email you, but I'll find it. But no.
X.AI was here 2 weeks ago in Cambridge, and they have Amy or Andrew. Apparently, people only ask Amy to set up their lunch dates. But the founder said that people are treating the AI like a person. So that,
Right.
Amy, would you please set this up for
Yeah.
me? And so will it be important to review the software? If we were to issue review of the software, would that also then affect the way that we review people? Are we treating people like machines?
Right.
And because we're treating machines like people.
So this is me being my favoritist towards humans. I would imagine as we're designing an AI system, we're going to try and design it most like ours, and then whoever's designing it gets to fix a few of our flaws. And that's the thing that we honestly have to wrestle with. So to answer the first question around people operations, project management, as we shift from physical work to idea work, as everything that can be outsourced to lesser intelligent robotics, right, is given to them, not AI, but just to straight robotics, as that's all outsourced, our roles become more and more about ideas, and ideas are still generated, at least right now, by our brains, right? And so I think we start there and we tie it back to people, because even in a project management system, a lot of the contextual variables are on people, right? I'm actually, so in my own, I don't want to give too much into my own things, but I'm actually dealing with an operations management issue right now that was a result of still a person. So I think we start there. On the broader AI question, I think it'd be really interesting to see how much AI psychology, I mean, this will be a department in the future, right? It's like AI psychology. How much that mind mirrors our own mind, and what quirks made the transfer and what quirks we fixed for. And then we have to, again, think about how do we innovate the factory for that. That's fascinating, though. I'm going to be.
We can start
you
that
just
right
ruined
now.
my in-flight
AI
movie, but that's
psychiatry.
okay.
Do that.
Yeah. No, I really do believe, because we're modeling it after the human mind, but trying to make it better. So we'll keep some things, we'll drop other things, and then we've got to do the study all over again. Yeah, fascinating.
Thanks.
Well, in the meantime, thank you all so much for having me. I knew I would get questions that, again, would ruin my in-flight movie, because I'll be thinking about them the whole time. So that's awesome. I'll linger and chat if there are any further questions. If there are not, great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. And whether these ideas resonated with you or they just spark new ones because you're thinking about how to innovate the factory of your team, of your workplace, et cetera, I hope we keep that conversation going and keep thinking about how we innovate our new idea factory. So thank you all so much for having me.